Okay, so this part of the lecture will deal more specifically with the readings in chapters 2 and 3. Part 3 will deal with chapter 4 with Grace Park and Battlestar Galactica. But this is specifically dealing with, again, Keanu Reeves and Tiger Woods. So we'll talk a little bit more about this history that Nishimei refers to in chapter 2, the idea of passing as this particular phenomenon in 19th and 20th century United States, specifically with African American communities. And really this does build out of a larger 19th century view of race, racial identity, and the idea that the qualities of human experience, the ideas of intelligence, physical ability, all these things are specifically passed through and are determined by racial identity, so that there are these things that are inherent to racial identity, such as capacity for learning, capacity for athleticism, for work, for personality, all these things. Again, these are all ideas that have been proven false by 20th century science in terms of genetic research, but these are things that were almost given in terms of 19th century notions of race. So much so that there was actually, again, these anti-miscegenation laws, these laws that prohibited specifically marriage and the creation of children between people of different races, for the fear that those particular children would be somehow deficient, that they would be, because they are, again, this is the way to think about it, is that they were treating race of the different racial categories that are created for humans as almost that they were separate species. This would be kind of like this weird inbreeding of different species that you would then create these kind of mongrel races. Again, this is the 19th century view. And also what happens is that because the reality is that, of course, this does happen, and that you have people who are multiracial, especially when you think about the idea of slaveholders in the South raping their females, enslaved females, and then producing children and creating multiracial children through that process. That once the institution of slavery ends and you have the institution of Jim Crow segregation, which basically created these two separate worlds for people who are identified as white and black, well, one of the realities of race is that because the biology is not necessarily clearly defined and clearly articulated through all physical features, is that you will have people who are children half African American, half white, one quarter the octoroon, the quadroon, these kind of weird 19th century delineations of blood quantum in terms of how people are defined racially. That you will have people who are then, even though because they have African ancestry in their heritage, and by rule, this one drop rule, which says that if you have one drop of African blood, you are in fact 100% African or black, that it is about how to manage and to actually police the racial politics in the South in the Jim Crow era in late 19th, early 20th century. And I'm talking really through in the 1960s when we think about Jim Crow segregation. And so when you have photographs, family photographs of this is an African American family. You can see that what happens is that, of course, the notions, those expressions of ethnic identity, of racial identity, become more imperceptible with future generations, and yet this is an African American, a black family. So this is part of the problem in terms of thinking about African American communities. And what happens is that you have this particular phenomenon of passing where African Americans who are light-skinned, who can actually, again, integrate into a quote-unquote white community, a white world, almost seamlessly and identify almost completely as white, is part of this particular process. And this is such a phenomenon in the African American community, especially in the late 19th and early 20th century, that the idea of the tragic mulatto becomes this particular literary sort of narrative theme that weaves its way throughout these different stories. And these are things that Nishimei refers to in her text. The tragic mulatto refers to the idea that again, this is usually a female women who are trying to escape their heritage or deny their African American ancestry to try to integrate into a quote unquote white world are somehow doomed to their particular fate, right? Because they are trying to both reject a community that will accept them, but also try to integrate in a community that, once they find out who they really are, will actually not only shun them further, but may actually try to kill them. And so this is part of that particular narrative of the tragic mulatto. And something that's referred to in Nishime's book is, again, this is something that appears in 1934, is the Hollywood film Imitation of Life, where one of the subplots is the light-skinned daughter of an African-American servant is trying to, again, integrate into a white world, and here she's confronted. We can see the light-skinned daughter being confronted by her mother and trying to figure out why, the mother's trying to figure out why she's working in this particular cashier, why she doesn't just come home and live with her family. This is part of a confrontation in terms of this idea of what happens when the person who's passing is outed or revealed in terms of their true identity. And you'll see the clip of this when you watch the online lecture for Allison Hobbs' 2014 text, A Chosen Exile. So Allison Hobbs is a Stanford historian, and her dissertation and eventually her book starts to reveal this particular history and uncover this particular history of passing in the United States in the 20th century. So one of the things I'm asking you to do in terms of a sort of outside these particular lectures is to watch her particular lecture, because she does a much better job explaining the phenomenon of passing, its particular impact on African American communities, and why it was an actual practice for African Americans who were light-skinned, who felt the need to actually, again, at one moment reject their idea of being African American or being black in the South, but also try to integrate into a much more white community, and then again sort of claim those particular forms of privilege that go along with whiteness in the late 19th and early 20th century. So that's a specific online video you'll need to watch. And again, she will have an extended clip from Imitation of Life, which you see here in the bottom right. So how does this play into someone like Keanu Reeves? Well, as Nishime points out, for Keanu Reeves, it's less about his racial ambiguity that really actually plays a role, even though he is clearly racially ambiguous. The idea that, what is a Keanu, or who is a Keanu, right, in terms of his racial background, is usually part of the original conversation when he's being interviewed. He's fairly upfront about the fact that he is multiracial, and so becomes less of a significant factor. But what in fact becomes more of the question for Keanu Reeves is, well, is he straight or is he gay? Remember that this is the mid-1980s. We also have this moment in terms of questions in terms of especially with the HIV crisis, the notion of a closeted gay lesbian community in the United States who are can hide in plain sight. And so, again, especially when we think about Hollywood celebrities, this is part of this kind of ongoing narrative, really from the 1920s through the present. The idea of, well, are celebrities straight or are they gay? It's something that, in terms of Hollywood, really does play an impact, because the idea that if you have a celebrity who is in fact gay, that reality of their personal lives can't be made public, because it would certainly doom their careers, it would doom their marketability. And so you have countless narratives about Hollywood celebrities who go to extraordinary extremes to try to hide their sexuality. This is actually a subject of a study called The Celluloid Closet from the 1980s that starts to reveal all these particular sort of not only the true lives of some of these Hollywood celebrities like Rock Hudson, but also how even in their films they are trying to deal with this idea that they are hiding or protecting their sexual identity. And so when Keanu Reeves first emerges, there is almost immediately the rumor of his sexuality. And of course, part of what fuels that is something like you see here, which is the promotional photographs for his first play, where he is playing a role as a gay man. And of course, the line between performance and real life almost immediately got blurred by the press and by people who are fascinated with Keanu Reeves. And of course, these are things that come out after he's actually received a specific element of celebrity recognitions, because this is this is his very first play, his very first performance, and so this is kind of this recovered information, this truth about Keanu Reeves, which of course is not really truth. It's merely, again, promotional material for a particular stage play that he does. But of course, it only then fuels the rumors more when he starts to work in other films where, again, his sexuality is somewhat ambiguous. In a movie like My Own Private Idaho, which is directed by Gus Van Sant, who is an openly gay man in Hollywood at the time. Again, something that is not necessarily heard of, especially someone who has a specific amount of respect and credential for being an out gay man, directing Hollywood movies in the 1980s. Again, the rumors then fly that is this particularly a gay movie? Is this a gay themed movie? Is it revealing something about Keanu Reeves' sexuality? So the idea of the ambiguity of Keanu Reeves is really part of what sort of drives his celebrity, even much more so than his racial ambiguity. The idea that you don't know, is he straight or is he gay? Of course, there's constant, and to this day, this constant sort of debate whether or not he is a closeted gay man, or in fact, he is just simply, a man who's living his life and really doesn't have an identity that's sort of tied to his sexuality. This also then comes about, especially in the, again, this is something that's a continuing narrative, even through the 2000s and up until today for Asian men. This is the details layout that was mentioned by Nishime in that same chapter about, well, how does this particular notion, this particular perception of Asian American male sexuality get played upon this notion of, true masculinity versus, a sort of, ambiguous sexuality. And so when she refers to this idea of the Asian American closet, this is actually a theoretical idea. It's not necessarily that the Asian Americans who are in Hollywood or in the public eye are closeted because they are secretly gay. It's not about their sexuality, but it's more about the idea that they don't reveal their or present their true ethnic identity, or they don't make their ethnic identity an explicit part of their particular identity in terms of being a celebrity. And so the case that they provide for that is someone like Dean Cain, who I showed you earlier, is in fact born Dean Tanaka. He is biracial Japanese and Caucasian, but almost immediately, as in terms of becoming a movie actor and then eventually a television actor and then sort of a minor celebrity, is that he almost never discusses his Japanese American ancestry, his ethnicity. He never goes by Dean Tanaka. And of course, part of the question is, well, is this because he's ashamed of being Japanese American? He wants to reject his particular Asian American identity. And as people start to dig deeper into Dean Cain's history, and part of the reality is that's not necessarily about a rejection of being Japanese in particular, but more of a strange relationship with his Japanese American father, who left his mother and him at a very young age. And so it's this kind of lingering animosity towards that father figure that sort of was then sort of replaced by his adoptive father, whose name is Cain, and he sort of took that particular name. So again, this is a much more personal kind of discussion for Dean Cain rather than an explicit rejection of being Japanese American per se. But of course, this is the notion that, well, he's just trying to make himself more marketable by not being, quote unquote, openly Asian or specifically Asian. And this is really the question that Keanu Reeves sort of plays into. Does he get more marketability by sort of playing up the idea that there is kind of this ambiguity, that he's not closing himself off to different roles, different possible starring and casting abilities by not identifying as Asian American or partially Asian American or multiracial, and that by his ambiguity has actually made himself far more a universal personality, right? So this is what the idea of the Asian American closet is really about in terms of Nishime's text, is thinking about how much is it about making that element of Asian ethnicity explicit in one's identity and personality. Of course, this is something that's very, very relevant when we go to someone like Tiger Woods.